Hi there, this is Pastor Dan Renshaw, pastor of Calvary Chapel in Cle Elum. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 14, verses 24 to 27, we find that fascinating story of Jesus walking on the water to come to his disciples while they're in the midst of a terrible storm on the Sea of Galilee, a storm that is threatening their lives. This story illustrates that there are times in our lives when we can be walking with the Lord, doing all we think he desires of us, and still things go south in a big way. When this happens, sometimes our fear can derail us. We see this with the fear of the disciples in this story. They had obeyed Jesus by getting in the boat and heading to the other side of the sea. But then they found themselves in this terrible storm in the midst of the night, and it looked like they were about to die. And while this was happening, they likely had at least two fears, maybe more. Let's look at the disciples' first fear. We pick up the story in Matthew 14:24. It says, "But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary." The disciples were not aware of the big picture here. Jesus had sent them ahead without him so he could spend some time alone in prayer, as verse 23 indicates. And that's what they'd done. They didn't understand all that Jesus did, but they had learned to trust him and to follow his directions. The scriptures don't say whether they knew Jesus was praying, but even if they did, they may not have thought about it much at this point because they had another concern at the moment. A huge storm had come up while they were out in the middle of the sea, and the wind was blowing in the opposite direction they wanted to go. And so they had to row the boat to move in the direction they needed to go. But they were apparently not making much progress, and the storm was really, really, really bad. Capernaum, their destination, is only about 5 miles away by boat, and it really should have been an easy journey for these experienced sailors and fishermen. But they get caught in the middle of this terrible windstorm. Mark says they were in the middle of the sea and they were straining at rowing. That means it was really hard. Not only that, we're told it was now the fourth watch of the night, meaning it was between 3 and 6 a.m. So it's been 8 or more hours since they launched, and they've only traveled around 3 or 4 miles. This gives you kind of a mental picture of what these 12 men were going through. How would you feel if you were in their situation? You might have already been perplexed that Jesus sent you away when things seemed to have been going so well that day. Not only is it very late at night and you're tired, exhausted, you find yourself rowing very hard and not making much progress. You're wet and cold, and it seemed a long time ago that you ate of the bread and the fish. Safety obviously is an issue because you also know that these storms can be very dangerous. The waves are crashing against your boat, making it creak and groan with the strain as you row for your life. You think it would be different if Jesus were there because he calmed the wind and stilled the waters the last time you had been in a storm like this, but he's not there. There's a huge element of fear because you know you could capsize and drown. So that's their first fear, and it's a substantial one. That brings us to the disciples' second fear. It's near Passover, so the moon would have been nearly full and would have illuminated the surrounding hills and the white caps of the waves. They then saw something they never could have expected. Matthew 14:25-26 carries on the story. It says, "Now in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them, walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, 'It is a ghost.' And they cried out for fear." It would have been frightening enough just being in the middle of the Sea of Galilee in the midst of a storm, but now there is something they simply cannot comprehend. The Greek word means that they were shaken, upset, thrown into confusion and alarm. The men saw something that was beyond their ability to understand. Something was coming to them in a way they could not have expected in their wildest dreams. They had been sent ahead and didn't expect to see Jesus until sometime later, after they reached Capernaum, supposing that, he would meet them there sometime the next day. They never expected Jesus to meet them in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, in any case, by any means, and even more so in the middle of such a windstorm. What would you think, and how would you react if you had been in their situation? Put yourself in their position. The wind and the waves are already causing fear. And then by the shadowy light of the moon, you see what appears to be the figure of a man who seems to be walking on top of the water. It's hard to know what you're seeing because the waves are tossing your boat around, as well as making the mystery figure go up and down too. You can't see any sort of boat, and since men don't walk on water, it can't be a man. But if it's not a man, then what is it? Well, all that's left is something from the supernatural, a phantom or a ghost of some sort. Wouldn't you be afraid? I know I would be. Of course you would, regardless of how much you might say you wouldn't. No doubt the hair on the back of your head would be standing straight out. The adrenaline would be pumping and your heart would be pounding, just like theirs did. No wonder they cried out for fear. Now listen, the circumstances of this situation are particular to the disciples, but all of us will face similar scenarios in life. Just when you think things are starting to go pretty well, God does something you don't understand. You submit and do what he says, and then find yourself in the midst of a situation beyond your control. Though you're trying your best to handle it. Then in the midst of that, something else comes at you which is totally incomprehensible, causing even more fear and wonder about what the future might hold. Most people do fine as long as everything's going well. But when troubles and trials start and things happen which are not understood, then faith is tested and often found to be not as large as previously thought. Your car breaks down, but before you can get it fixed, the roof starts leaking, then the furnace gives up, and you get a notice from a collection agency for a bill that you were sure you paid. Or perhaps it's more serious. Your job is threatened or you lose it. In the middle of that, there is a health crisis, or a friend rejects you, or a loved one dies. The storms of life have been bad enough, and you've been rowing as hard as you can to reach shore, but now you're facing something that you don't even understand. In fear and frustration, you start questioning if God knows what he's doing and wondering why he's abandoned you. How does God respond to us, and how should we respond to God at those times? Listen, we may not be able to handle our fears, but God can. And so the disciples cry out in fear. Who are they crying out to? I suppose they could have been crying out to each other, but what good would that do? My guess is they were actually crying out to the only one who could possibly help them, God. And what happens immediately after they cry out to God? Jesus arrives in the midst of their fear. Verse 47 says, "But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, 'Be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid.'" That is so comforting. Jesus let them know that he was there. Mark 6:48 notes that while they were in the boat and Jesus was alone on the mountain praying, that they were never out of his care. Mark 6:47 to 48 says, "Now, when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land," that is Jesus. "Then he saw them straining at rowing, for the wind was against them." They may have felt alone and abandoned, but Jesus had his eye on them, even from his place of prayer. The same, I believe, is true for us. While they were straining at the oars in the midst of the windstorm, Jesus had been praying on the mountain. And from the various prayers of Jesus that are recorded, we know that a frequent element in his prayers was intercession for his followers. What better position could they or we be in than having Jesus Christ praying for us? If the disciples had known this, their fears might have been significantly calmed. Certainly they did, and we do face frightening situations. But knowing that Jesus is interceding for us should bring reassurance and peace. But Jesus not only prayed, he also responded to the need for which he was praying, and he went to be with the disciples. And when they cried out in fear, it caused him to identify himself and to calm their fears. Be of good cheer, he said. It is I, do not be afraid. When he said, it is I, they are the same words that God used to tell Moses his name in Exodus 3:14. In the Hebrew, it's Yahweh. In the Greek, ego eimi, I am. Jesus took the divine name and applied it to himself, just as he did in the Gospel of John 8:58, when he said, before Abraham was, I am. This was no apparition, but it was Christ the Creator walking on the water. It was the sovereign Lord who rules over the details of his creation among them. So he could say, cheer up, I am. I'm not a ghost or a figment of your fearful imagination. I am Creator. I am the one that comforts. I am faithful, and I am with you. And if indeed Jesus Christ is who the Bible reveals him to be, then do not be afraid. Jesus is still the same. Jesus' promise to the apostles in Matthew 28 is still true for us. He is still with those that have placed their faith in him and have believed in his name. He will never leave us. He will never forsake us. We may not understand all that goes on or why it happens, but we Christians know that the Lord Jesus Christ, the creator of the universe, is with us, and it should always be enough to be entrusted to his care. Many of you know this same experience of the disciples. You have faced the fear of disease or bad news or death's door or an accident or some other situation. Right in the midst of fear, you have looked to the Lord. You've thought upon him and all of his glory and majesty, coming to the earth for you, living a holy life for you, dying an atoning death for you, rising from the dead for you, and now interceding for you. You've thought of his promises and recognized his presence, and suddenly the fear is gone. The situation is still there. You're still ill, or you still have the bad news, or you still face great loss, but the fear that has intensified in your mind vaporizes. Christ, who conquers the fear of death, the greatest fear, has drawn near, telling you, do not be afraid. It is in the certainty that Jesus Christ is who he claims to be that you face fear in the midst of whatever life brings, and you overcome that fear by staying focused on Jesus. I hope this has been helpful. If it has, why not share it on your own timeline so others can be helped too? This is Pastor Dan Renshaw from Calvary Chapel, Cle Elum. God bless.